Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, last year I had the opportunity of addressing you briefly in this room about the accounts of the Association. This afternoon I'm honoured to have been invited to present some 500 or so more accounts on the building accounts of the medieval cathedrals in England. But first I would like to say some thank yous. Firstly to Dr. Linda Monckton, who as Director of the Association invited me to do this. We have shared an interest in Exeter Cathedral for some years, and she's been most encouraging about the work there. Secondly, to Dr. Paul Barnwell, my supervisor in Oxford, who first suggested I embark on this mad project and has been very supportive. And finally, I'd like just to pay a word of thanks to many people in this profession, some of you of whom are in this room, for the encouragement and the help that they've given me along the way after a commercial career in publishing. The project I want to describe this afternoon is a systematic analysis of all the surviving medieval fabric rolls of the English cathedrals. They are building accounts. They provide simple listings of all receipts and expenses, or subtotals of those items, ending with a reckoning of the surplus or deficit each year, which is expressed as the amount owed to or owed by the keeper of the works. Owed to or owed by the keeper of the works to the cathedral treasury or to the patron of the work. Written records on parchment rolls were first introduced in about 1200, and more than 509 of these have survived to the present day. The building transactions listed in the accounts have been recorded in the form of Excel spreadsheets from published or to be published translations, from Latin transcriptions, or from the original manuscripts. The spreadsheets, which include about 120,000 items, are now being summarized in about 50 pages of tables of supplementary income to accompany the thesis, which should be submitted during the course of next academic year. This paper is presented as a measure of work in progress rather than any way a final conclusion to the work. Work on the fabric rolls is not new, of course. Scholars and antiquarians have used them since the mid-18th century, but many of the rolls were not generally accessible to the early to mid-20th century. Despite early pointers from Robert Willis and others, there has been little in the way of systematic analysis of the material which the cathedral rolls contain. Most inquiries have sought answers to such questions as when particular cathedral features were built, or where particular patrons and artists operated, and they usually involve the rolls of a single cathedral. W.H. Froome's ambitious work on the financing of cathedral building in the Middle Ages, published in Dutch in 1984, was the great Europe-wide exception, though it did not analyse the expense side. The application of spreadsheet analysis to the whole range of accounts makes such analysis more feasible. The assembly of comparable spreadsheet data over different sites and different periods makes it easier to recognise changing patterns in cathedral building programmes and to answer such questions as to how cathedral programmes changed and why. The recent literature of architectural history in the late Middle Ages is considerably concerned with the transfer of architectural design and ideas between different sites and different masons. It relates to the now well-established role of the master mason as architect. The intention here is rather to focus attention on the role of the master mason as manager. The period under discussion saw numerous changes in the scale and direction of resources for great church projects, which were duly reflected in the organisation of the workforce. The analysis demonstrates the central role of the mason in relation to the patrons, in the transmission of design and plans, in the recruitment and motivation of craftsmen, the outsourcing of specialist work, the employment of subcontractors, the choice of stone and other materials, and in the logistics of supply. The question of how the practice of the master mason would adjust to reorganisation in the workplace is a key one during the later years of the period, as foundations were laid for the modern era. This evening, I plan to discuss 4 themes: the fabric rolls as evidence, the scale and direction of great church projects in the later medieval ages, the master mason as manager, and managing the masons. The existence of separate fabric funds in the medieval cathedrals has its origins in the 5th century, when funding for church buildings, the Carta Fabricis Applicanda, was first held separately from the other 3 diocesan funds for the household expenses of the bishop, the clergy, and the poor. This laid the foundations for the future distinctions between the common and fabric funds, which arose later in the Middle Ages. The responsibility for great church buildings, as well as the lighting and tolling of bells, became that of the custos operis, or keeper, who was normally a member of the clergy elected for the purpose. The continental European cathedrals tended to have smaller dioceses and to be more reliant on civic funding than those in England, and the fabrica ecclesiae tended to evolve independently, a few becoming powerful and wealthy under a magister fabricae such as those at Cologne and Strasbourg. The English cathedrals, however, took a different route after the Norman-led building of all 17 cathedrals by the end of the 12th century. The new dynasty took care to integrate the monastic cathedrals, which represented about half of the total. All but one of these fell under the Benedictine order, which actively regulated financial processes through its regular synods. The early fabric accounts were based on exchequer and manorial practices, which would have been familiar to cathedral treasurers through the cathedral's own estate accounts and the tithe system. By the early 1200s, the cathedrals had developed the charge and discharge, or compotus account, in which the custos acted as the agent of the treasurer or patron as principal. Hitherto, annual accounts had been given orally for the auditors to hear and approve. More formal audits, which demanded written accounts, were made obligatory for the monasteries in 1335 by Gregory IX, and the last of the secular cathedrals to follow the new practice must have followed shortly afterwards. The fabric rolls of the monasteries differed. In Canterbury, Westminster and Winchester, fabric rolls under the custos operis were similar to those of the secular cathedrals. In the others, new works were usually accounted for in separate accounts of the bishop, while renovations and repairs to the existing fabric were traditionally reported in the rolls of the sacrist. The sacrist was one of the principal obedientaries of the prior, and the building accounts were often, but not always, reported in summary form, severely reducing the amount of information available in the sacrist rolls at Canterbury, Durham, and Norwich. Though no cathedral fabric roll fragments survived before 1279, the Ely account memoranda of 1234 to 50, which summarised Bishop Northwold's financing of the new 6-bay presbytery at Ely, are clearly based on the sacrist roll entries of that time and the earliest detailed reference that we have to an English fabric roll. The period which is covered by this survey, the 250 years before the Reformation, is determined by the accident of survival of individual account rolls over the period. While it has been popularly supposed that many of these documents were destroyed during the Reformation and Civil War, this was not universally the case. In the monastic cathedrals, Henry VIII's new cathedral foundations, which replaced the priory obedientories, were quite as careful to retain the documents which supported their claims to property and revenue. And the survival rate of fabric rolls in the secular cathedrals is certainly no better. The overall losses to the fabric rolls have been much due to misuse and poor storage, as can be seen from the continued losses since modern record keeping began. The remaining accounts form a significant data sample by any standards, but one which has its own limitations. The fabric rolls of the 13th century building campaigns are entirely missing, which leaves a somewhat skewed sample, a richly detailed 60 years from 1290 to 1350, which is followed by 2 centuries in which diocesan cathedral building is significantly reduced, while the larger scale campaigns continued intermittently at the metropolitan cathedrals of Canterbury and York and at Westminster Abbey. This investigation specifically excludes the royal works, which were directly financed from the royal purse, notably those of Henry III and Henry VII at Westminster Abbey and those at St George's Chapel, Windsor, as well as works which are no longer standing. However, the 14th to 16th century accounts of Westminster Nave are fully discussed. Their fabric fund operated in a standalone manner similar to those of the cathedrals, and the interchange of ideas and craftsmen between the cathedrals and the abbey made it an essential part of the story. The accounts of Ripon Minster, a secular sub-cathedral under the direction of the Archbishop of York, have also been included as a rare example of a smaller great church with a workable series of rolls. The total number of fabric rolls in the survey is 509. They constitute, as far as can be ascertained, all the extant rolls from the medieval cathedrals, as well as the contemporary rolls from Westminster and Ripon, making 14 great churches in all. The usefulness of each series is largely determined by the percentage of original rolls which have survived. So we get a long series of rolls. This list of the cathedrals is arranged in date order in the order of the first fabric roll that they have that's survived, and you've got the number of rolls going down there. And as you can see, the whole sample is dominated by Exeter with 111 rolls, Westminster Abbey with 126, York with 45, Ely with 36, and Durham, which is often not talked about in this context, with 35, and of course the ongoing rolls of Norwich cloisters, plus some survivals of sacristy rolls, which amount to 65. The remaining cathedrals, there are 7 with significant sequences of fabric rolls. Then there are 7 more that have got fragments or small series. The smaller series are worthwhile, but it tends to be 1 or 2 short runs that explain a particular feature, such as the short series at Salisbury that addresses the crossing tower vault in the late 15th century, or such as the short series at Canterbury that talks about the Bell Harry Tower. In addition to the survival rate, the other thing that helps with interpretation is the length of sequence of individual sequences of the rolls. These partly follow the amount of material that's available absolutely, but if you take a sequence as being a run of rolls that doesn't have gaps of more than 2 years, so that it can be reasonably interpreted, there's a great difference between Exeter and Westminster, which have average sequence lengths of 20 and 32, and Ely, which has 14, York, which has only 6, and Ripon, which has only 3. And it makes a huge difference to the interpretation process. Exeter stands out not only for its high survival rate and long sequences, but also because much of the expenditure is accounted for on a weekly basis, allowing the progress and organisation of the work and the supply chain to be examined with unusual precision. The number of transactions recorded in Exeter is correspondingly greater, amounting to over 80,000 transactions in all. The great majority of the extant rolls are in good condition, though many carry the marks of damp, decay, and poor restoration of earlier years. The opportunity to investigate all of the extant rolls from a medieval data source is rare. The surviving material relates to the years 1274 to 1544, and the sample provides good geographical range from Durham and York in the north to Ely and Norwich in East Anglia to Exeter and Wells in the southwest. And there's a good balance between secular and monastic cathedrals. The total numbers of accounts produced during the period is not knowable due to the differing accounting practices in the monasteries, but it is a reasonable assumption that the accounts in this survey represent not less than 10% of the annual accounts which once existed. I would now like to move on to questions relating to changes in scale and the direction of the fabric rolls. In his new work on Gothic wonder, published last year, Paul Binsky reminds us that the economics of European cathedral building were the subject of considerable debate in the 1960s, when Robert Lopez suggested that the ambitions of the great church building in France were essentially self-defeating. The question was whether the landscape of half-completed churches in 1300, which was to remain that way for centuries, marked the end of the age of the cathedral. In England, the timing of the change came later. The earlier part of our period, between 1300 and 1350, represented the final stage of the main Gothic rebuilding of the cathedrals, which included the decorated naves, choirs, and lady chapels at Exeter, Ely, Lichfield, and Wells. In terms of liturgy, it marked the culmination of architecture which supported the Sarum rite and the centrality of Mary. The more sober and personal documents of purgatory and the afterlife called for smaller projects, such as chantries and memorials, which gathered in clerical and lay popularity in the years after the Black Death. But the grander scale projects still continue at Canterbury, York, and Westminster Abbey. The building accounts in our sample give extensive information about the sources of finance and the makeup of costs of cathedral building campaigns, and it is possible to deduce an overall picture of the economics of cathedral building. In the analysis which follows, one fact stands out above all others, and that is the importance of the Black Death as the fracture line between the period of the Gothic rebuilding of the cathedrals, which had begun in about 1160, and the period of more scattered development which followed. I'm conscious of the need to be a little careful here, because a number of our most respected historians, such as Christopher Dyer, tend to downplay the relevance of what happened in 1348 to 49 in favour of an economic turning point in about 1300, and exacerbated by the famines of 1310 and the recurring bouts of plague throughout the second half of the century. But for the cathedral economy, 1348 to 49 is a clear-cut break. There are only 3 roll sequences which straddle those years, those of Exeter, Ely, and Westminster Abbey. The Exeter Fund received legacies and burials at what the scribe described as the time of mortality, and at the same time there was a break in clergy and tithe income which was never recovered. In Westminster, it's difficult to notice the difference, but the roll records the purchase of 3 sarcophagi from neighbouring St. Margaret's. The stark realities of the situation are still apparent to present-day readers of the Ely rolls. Parchment which had been bought on a yearly basis from a local parchment merchant was no longer available from the regular supplier, and the account records that 2 shillings were spent on making 3 dozen parchments in the monastery, and a later account shows that ink was made at the same time. These homemade rolls have not survived well. The manuscript parchment still crumbles in one's hand and is written in watery ink, which sometimes leaves traces only of two points of the nib. The recorded receipts that year were about half of their previous levels in 1345-46, farm income reduced by 81% to just £31, and the Ely Grange was worst hit of all, with farm income reduced from £79 the previous year to £2.4 and twopence halfpenny that year. The disaster brought with it a surge in St. Etheldreda's shrine offerings, which increased almost fourfold to £39, and they remained at a higher level for many years to come. Expenses were limited, and no new works occurred. William Hurley received his retainer. John Stobart, the senior mason, worked for 44 weeks, and a carpenter attended to the houses of the obedientaries and the bridge and causeways at £1 shilling a week, besides a board and a robe. However, the key evidence is not these things, but the contextual evidence of the rolls. The principal cost of building great churches, no different from today's project, was the labour cost, in this case of the masons. And if we take the rebuilding of Exeter Cathedral between 1279 and 1342, which is almost all of the cathedral that we can see today, except for the Norman towers, the total costs may have amounted to 12,000. We have exact records of 5,209 of that, which was of which 1,613, or 31% of the total, was the cost of the masons' weekly wages, so 31% of the costs. Many of the non-labour costs, such as the quarries and stone and much of the cost of transport, were also labour-related. I still have much work to do on transport costs and materials, but generally speaking, they seem to follow the same line as the mason's cost. So if we look at the trend and see what happens, we get this. The bar chart shows the years of the wage rates prevailing in periods of 10 years. Only every second bar is marked in periods of 20 years, just so that you can see the numbers. There are 4 rates that we have here. The blue one at the top is the highest rate, and often that is a fee to the weekly wages of the mason or some sort of specialist task. The majority of masons were senior masons in the red, or experienced masons on the green bars. The red and green bars from the 1370s are 40% and 25% higher than those before 1348-49. If we take Westminster Abbey, we can see a similar pattern. Here we only have one set of bars dealing with the period before the Black Death, and that's the first one. But you can see a similar, the 1340 bars, you can see the similar sort of pattern where the red masons and green masons rates increase between 48 and 56%. The increasingly surprising thing is that once the rates settled by 1380, they remained at those rates for 160 years, which we also saw at Exeter. There's an interesting side question here as to what extent Masons' wage rates were affected by the Statute of Labour. This was a measure promulgated in 1351 and again in 1360 and renewed from time to time up till Tudor times. And it was intended to keep on the lid on the masons and other wages. Masons were thought to be the most likely group to act in combination to push up their wages in the great scarcity of labour which followed the plague. The statute declared maximum rates of 4p per day, i.e. 24p per week, for masters of masons, and 3p a day, i.e. 18p per week or less, for other masons. It seems that the statute was unrealistically trying to regulate London wages at country rates, which were below the level of the previous London regulations. They were invariably ignored by most of the great churches. However, at Westminster Abbey, which would have had to tread with care, pay rises may simply have been delayed for a year until November 1351, when masons were appointed at 3 and 2p, i.e. 38p a week, and again much later, in the summer of 1496 and the following year, when 7 carpenters' pay was held at the statutory 6p per day for a number of years. So we get Westminster Abbey towing the line, but delaying it in 2 instances that we can see clearly. We follow on to York. Here the layout is the same, and all of the records here are from after the Black Death, because the York rolls only begin, the ones that have survived only start from the 1360s. But we can see very clearly here how the rate of 6p a day or 36p per week is maintained very solidly for 170 years. The blue lines, in most cases, the senior mason, sometimes somebody doing something specialist. The majority of people were on that red rate. I'll very quickly pass over the other cathedrals just to show you that all of them had the same pattern. This is the fragments that I was talking about earlier. It includes Durham, Ely, Hereford, Norwich, Ripon, Salisbury. St Paul's carpenters we have from 1326, which fall into the general pattern, Wells and Winchester. So you can see, particularly again, if you look at the red lines, which is where the majority of salaries were, we've got a flat line going from 1380 right through. The evidence of the masons' wages is surprisingly clear and consistent through the sample. Masons' wages, which were stable in the first half of the 14th century, rose by about 50% as a direct consequence of the Black Death from 1350 and remained at the same level until the Reformation. Further analysis of materials and transport costs will be done to support or otherwise this conclusion. Time will not allow now for a detailed analysis of the income, but I'm simply going to show you 2 examples of the income of fabric funds, which you can see went in a different direction. This is Exeter, and this is the whole series from 1299 right through to 1514. And you can see that the lines are very clear, but there's a general downward trend in those revenues. Now, this particular chart shows you the revenues of the gifts of the patrons as well. So you do get those very high years at the beginning when Bishop Stapleton was giving all sorts of amounts of money. But nevertheless, even if you start with 1350, you can, when that had all finished, you can see a downward trend which continued. If you look at York, I've done it differently here. Here I've excluded the spiritualities, I've excluded the donations by the archbishops, I've excluded clergy gifts. This is basically temporalities, secular income, including commercial income. But the trend is exactly the same and is undeniable. There's an interesting point here that you can see at the end of the period, after 1520, the income remained static, and that's because there were some improvements made to the accounting methods, which I won't go into here, which stabilized the way that people dealt with bad debts and made them take off bad debts as they occurred, rather than keeping them in a balance sheet. But that's another story. Binsky reduces the questions that he asks about the cathedral economy, and that the scholars asked in the 1960s, to whether the building cost of great churches was still affordable, and if so, whether it remained imaginable. These figures suggest that for the diocesan cathedrals after the Black Death, the large-scale cathedral building campaigns were no longer affordable nor imaginable unless there were examples of extraordinary patronage. The great national churches at Canterbury and York and Westminster had wider and stronger resources to financial patronage, which enabled them to continue these projects to the Reformation. I now want to move rather quickly to some discussion of the role of the Master Mason as manager in these circumstances. The appointment of the Master Mason was crucial to any cathedral campaign. The scope and level of the appointment, as well as the Mason's reporting lines, depended on the nature of the project. Although we talk of Masons, it should not be forgotten that the operations could be headed by master carpenters, particularly if the timber component in the work was important. There are 70 masters whose careers are touched on in the rolls. The Master Mason generally took charge of the whole workforce and would have been responsible for outsourced specialist tasks and for subcontractors on the site. Groups of carpenters, blacksmiths and glaziers working on the project often had their own masters who would come under the ambit of the Master Mason. The list of 70 masters includes 6 master carpenters who were in charge of overall operations. Such a master carpenter was John Ashcombe of York, who was initially responsible for the timber vaulting of York Minster Choir and perhaps the stores from 1415 to 1434. Thomas of Whitney, who was successively master at Winchester, Exeter and Wells, was a rare example of a master who was equally proficient in both crafts. The tradition had been established by the 13th century that the diocesan bishop took responsibility for the patronage and commissioning of new works, while the dean and chapter looked after the renovation and repair of old works. The dean and chapter delegated financial responsibility for the fabric fund to a custos operis, or accountant, elected by the chapter, but normally a chaplain of subcanonical rank in the secular cathedrals, though a senior obedientary normally filled the position in the monasteries whenever the works were substantial. The stipend for performing the role was generally £2 or £3 per annum, though it ranged up to £5 at York. The Master Mason worked closely with the custos, but for major new works of the 14th and 15th century, he appears to have taken directions from the episcopal or other patron. Most were deeply committed to the building most bishops were deeply committed to their building campaigns and would certainly have been aware of the latest architectural trends in the capital. They would have played a key part in the selection of their master masons, a good number of whom had London experience at the Royal Works, at St Stephen's Chapel or at the Abbey. There is evidence that Master Roger and Thomas of Whitney worked closely with Bishop Stapledon and Bishop Grandison respectively, as did Master John and William Hurley with Alan of Walsingham, the sacrist at Ely. The close working relationship with patron bishops continued through to the end of the period when John Westell corresponded directly with Cardinal Morton in the selection of detailed pinnacle designs for the Bell Harry Tower at Canterbury. This is the sole drawing that you can find when you go through the Rolls archives in the cathedrals. What seems to have been the rejected design is the one that has miraculously survived in the archive, the only such example in the cathedral archives, as I said. Such relationships were not always of the best, however, and it is significant that John Lewin, master of the extensive monastic estates of Durham, appears not to have taken place in Bishop Hatfield's Neville screen in the presbytery of the cathedral. The master masons were highly rewarded. In the early 14th century, traditional masons were paid large stipends ranging from £5 to £10 per annum, without supplemental weekly wages, but as individual projects became more specialised, it was more common to pay a smaller fee of £1 to £1.6 and 8, 2 marks was usual, and together with full weekly wages of 3 and 4 per week. This could give total earnings of up to £8 to £9 a week when there was a full programme. The change from annual stipend to the retaining fee with weekly wages was clearly driven by the changing nature of cathedral operations, reflecting the change from longer-term campaigns to more scattered specialist projects. As such, the change was gradual. It was in 1346 in Exeter, but much later in 1450 in York. The traditional master mason salaries placed them in the higher bracket of income earners. We can gauge how this might have worked at Exeter, where the regular contributions to the fabric fund of the bishops, deans and canons' contributions of half their stipends were agreed with Bishop Bitton in 1297. On this basis, Master Roger's stipend of £6 per annum from 1298 can be compared to that of the dean, who may have been paid £12 14 and 8 yearly, and to that of the treasurer, the second highest officer in the chapter, at £6 and 8 shillings. The Exeter master also received the use of a house and a robe. The large number of major building projects, together with the intensity of craft skills required for the highest levels of decorated design, brought a shortage of high-status architects in the early 14th century, well before the advent of the plague. One of the first master masons to work on multiple sites was Thomas of Whitney, who was recruited to Exeter from Winchester by 1317 and took up residence in Wells in 1324 to develop his career in Wells and more widely, continuing with his existing responsibilities for Exeter. He retained his Exeter stipend of £6 13 and 4 and in all probability earned a full fee for his remarkable work at Wells at the same time. Whitney continued his career at Exeter with energy and innovation, completing the nave with its advanced traceries and the integral east and north walks of the cloisters, outsourcing the quarry work and changing transport routes. William Hurley, who arrived at Ely in 1334, by 1334, who designed Ely's timber octagon and who also worked over several sites. He is unlikely to have been the certain man from London who arrived at Ely to initiate the new works there 10 years before. While the date of his appointment is not known, the insertion of a celebrated memo in the 1334-35 accounts recording that 8 carpenters stayed for 9 weeks, elevating the great posts in the new choir, suggests a six-year delay between the completion of the masonry octagon and the erection of the octagon timber platforms. This would have been most unlikely if Hurley had already been in post. Hurley earned £8 for at least five years during the completion of the timber octagon and continued to earn a retainer of £1 per annum until his death in 1354. His high fees were clearly a matter of contention in the monastery, and their cost was defrayed by an annual subsidy of £2.14 by John of Huntingdon, which came from the rents from the town. Hurley must have been the wealthiest mason of his generation. While working on Ely, he was appointed chief carpenter of the King's Works south of the Trent and Humber, with fees of £18 five shillings per annum, and transported an engine to Scotland for the siege of Dunbar, a journey of 11 weeks. His appointment to Ely may have been influenced by the Royal Works, concerned to meet the challenge of spanning a 70-foot diameter with a 30-foot void at its centre. This went well beyond the frontiers of existing timber technology. We have only 2 examples of multi-site practices from before the Black Death, but this became more common in the years that followed. 2 outscaled all the others and were more commercial. John Lewin operated from Durham, where he was master mason of the priory and its estates in the northern counties and Scottish borders from 1367 to 1398. His castles at Bamborough, Carlisle, Roxburgh, Bolton, Raby and Dunstanburgh were built for the Crown and for senior northern magnates. In addition to his stipends, which were £13.16 and 8 in his earliest years at Durham, he must have had substantial earnings on the basis of the £300 he received from his Carlisle Castle works and the £400 he eventually recovered from the Crown for Roxburgh. Lewin's reputation at Durham is best recalled through his buttressed keep-like Prior's Kitchen, 1366 to 68, with its vaulted chimney space adjoining the cloisters at Durham. It employed 33 masons and 74 quarry workers during the first phase of work of 79 weeks, at a total cost of £180, 18 and 7 for the first phase of the work. In all, there are 9 multi-site masters in our sample, continuing through to the 15th and 16th centuries. Some continued beyond the Reformation to lay the grounds for further development. There are 2,700 named masons in the survey. Most are from the Exeter, Westminster, Durham and York rolls. It's unfortunate that almost none of the detailed wage lists which were originally attached to the quarterly or termly accounts have survived. The names which have survived are all recorded, or almost all recorded, in the main annual accounts. The only names that precede the Black Death are from Exeter, Westminster cloisters, and a few strays from Ely and elsewhere. In general, the masons' names from the early 14th century have place names of origin. Their meticulous recording depends on the scribe and the customs. The early Exeter rolls show that about 30% of the masons came from the surrounding counties of Dorset, Somerset and Devon. The individual places often reflect the location of cathedral suppliers, for example, Bridport for rope, Corfe for Purbeck marble, and Taunton for ironwork. A very few came from Cornwall. The Westminster names of this period are much more widely scattered. The popular perception has been that the masons were transient, as Saltzman has noted, but from the perspective of individual cathedrals, which were embarked upon longer-term building campaigns, the evidence is that the masons were stable employees. At the end of Master Roger's term at Exeter in 1310, 7 of the 19 craftsmen employed had been with him from the beginning. During Whitney's term, from 1342, there was much more churn. At the end of his term, 7 of the workers had first joined him 25 years before. Master Thomas had been tasked with preparing the exquisite altar furnishings of the Exeter High Altar area, including the Reridus Sedilia Bishop's Throne and stalls, much of which mercifully still remains. Lacking local expertise, he commissioned a separate high altar team from the home counties, led by John de Banbury and his son Adam, at higher rates, about 20% higher rates than the local masons. The team completed its work with success over 6 years and dispersed, leaving some of its members behind to support local expertise. The Exeter poll records of 1377 can be cross-related to the masons' wage lists of the same year. This was just 4 years after the long break in the rolls following the Black Death. Fabric income was £194 that year, and expenditure was £125. Robert Lessingham, the newly recruited master from Gloucester, was at work on the northwest corner of the cloisters, and Walter Gist, the veteran local carpenter, was repairing defects in the belframe of the North Tower. 22 masons and 2 craftsmen were employed at the same time during the year, 8 of whom were paid at the highest rate of 3 and 4pence. The poll tax records record that 7 of these were householders of Exeter, Master Thomas Glazier and 6 others. The 6 others were paid between 2 shillings and 3pence and 2 shillings and 7pence per week, and of these 2 paid higher tax at 6pence, and the other 4 paid 4pence, which was the lowest level of tax. Traditionally, much has been made of the divisions of function and rank among masons. As far as the roles are concerned, flexibility seems to have been the order of the day. The categories that are mentioned are carvers and imaginators, entailers, freemasons, cutters, setters, layers, cubitorius, positories, ledgeries, marblers, and polishers. These positions are not used consistently in the roles, and it is difficult to analyse how the wages compare. Their absence in Exeter in Master Roger's time suggests that the work was handled with flexibility. The highest rates, specialist rates, were paid to sculptors such as John Pratt, who worked on the Exeter West Front image screen in 1374 for 5 shillings a week. A special allowance of 6 shillings and 8pence per annum, and plus gloves provided, was paid to setters in York from 1401 onwards, and this was paid at increased rates to masons who set stones at height in the tower in 1433, 1445 and 1446. However, the practice of extra rates for the setters appears to have died away from the 1450s. However, Westminster Abbey, setting allowances of 4pence per week, were regularly paid from 1473 onwards. The highest rates were paid to high-level setters working with a scaffolding team on the high vaults, who could earn up to 4 shillings and 4pence per week at the end of the period. The roles show considerable evolution in the way the masons worked together. In the early 14th century, Master Roger was able to recruit and run a team of 30 masons in a quite paternal fashion. He recruited locally, often from families of the workforce or suppliers. He had a personally crafted wage scale which allowed for career progression and ensured stability in the workforce. It can be seen from rather fragmentary evidence from Ely, from the Durham kitchen, and from the Westminster cloisters that this was fairly normal practice up till the 1370s, when the masons' wage rates first stabilised after the Black Death. The pressures resulting from the post-plague shortage of labour and the need to recruit experienced masons brought about standard wage rates at the higher level. The nature of more specialist projects brought about teams of workers who were employed on an ad hoc focused basis. From the 1370s onwards, the focus of work described in the rolls changes from a workforce engaged in long-term building campaigns to a series of specialist activities by teams of workers who are likely to be employed for the duration of the task at standard rates of pay rather than to have continuous employment as in earlier years. A good example, and a suitable one to end this talk, was Richard Russell's and others' high-paid teams of scaffolders at Westminster Abbey in the years 1486 to 91. Richard raised the scaffolding, partitioned the vaults with canvas, built the centring, levelled the platforms for stoneworking, and moved the great wheel 100 feet above the ground for each of the last 6 vaults of Westminster Abbey, before dismantling it all, simply to erect it once again at the next bay. Richard Russell was paid 8p per day, and his 2 fellow carpenters earned 6p a day, and they did this work in approximately 60 days for each bay. The narrative of task-based teams of workers, like so much else in this survey, relates back to the changes which took effect from 1350. There is still much to do. I still have much to do in integrating the findings, but that much is clear, and I thank you all for listening to me this evening.